All right. Welcome back to another episode of Yoga Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Waycott. On today's episode, I am going to do a listener Q&A session. So this is my first time doing this, and earlier this week, I had the idea that it would be fun to answer your questions, like you, the listeners of the podcast. And so I shared a quick little story on Instagram, and I said, send me your questions, anything to do with teaching yoga, running a yoga business, personal questions for me. And you did. So I'm going to go through a few of those questions today and do my best to offer my perspective on them. I feel like I'm kind of filming this episode in real time, so to speak, like quite close to when I'll actually be releasing it. Over the summer, I was banking episodes for the podcast just so that I didn't feel, a sense of rush or urgency to have to constantly be producing every week. But I really want to put out this episode and, answer your questions. Just in a reasonable amount of time. That's kind of fun. And this past weekend, I was guest teaching in a Reiki training, which was really cool. I got to offer a yoga practice for the trainees, and the idea behind the practice was just to offer something that was really grounding because, as you know, if you have experienced energy work or if you're an energy worker yourself, that sometimes that kind of work can really take us out of our bodies and up into our heads. And so I got to offer a really gentle grounding yoga practice yesterday for the group. And then I also got to take the Reiki training and attend as a student. And that was really, really cool. So now I guess I have officially received my level 1 Reiki attunement, and I am allowed to practice Reiki on children and animals. And so I gave my dog, Waylon, a little Reiki session yesterday, and he seemed to really like it. So I am looking forward to, practicing that a little bit more. But anyways, I'm going to jump right into your questions, and I have your questions in front of me here. So I'm going to start with the first one, and I just want to say that I love all of these questions because they definitely bring up such real, practical things that we face as yoga teachers. And I know that if one person is asking these questions, that other people are also thinking the same thing. So we'll start with one that I hear a lot, and thank you for the person who submitted this. The question is, how do I find reasonable space to run my pre-registered classes? And I'm going to guess that what you mean by reasonable is a space that is suitable for yoga and a space that is also reasonably priced, that's going to allow you to bring in a profit from your pre-reg classes. And I know that our first instinct when it comes to looking for spaces to run our own classes is often to look towards yoga studios and fitness studios because typically they're beautiful, they're aesthetically pleasing, they have all the props and equipments that we need for class, they usually have a good ambiance, and all of those things that just are going to make teaching feel really good. But one of the challenges with looking towards those spaces for pre-reg is that most of the time, the prime teaching slots are already reserved for public classes as part of the studio's own drop-in schedule. And so when we're looking to rent the space, then sometimes our options for class times are limited and we're left with middle of the day time slots or an afternoon on a weekend time slot. And some of those might be great for workshops, but maybe not so great for something consistent, especially if we are catering our classes towards a demographic that maybe works from 9 to 5 and needs an evening class, for example. And so instead of trying to squeeze into someone else's schedule, I would definitely start thinking about non-yoga spaces that could work out just as well or even better for your pre-reg classes. And I've personally had really positive experiences working specifically with like clinic type spaces for pre-reg classes. So the space that I run my pre-reg classes out of right now is essentially like a multidisciplinary clinic. So during the daytime, they offer services like chiropractic care, registered acupuncture, registered massage therapy, like things of that nature. And when I go in to teach my yoga classes, it's basically after hours. So there's nobody there. I'm just using this like big empty space. Nobody's coming in for appointments or anything like that. And it works out really, really well. So I think the first thing to do if you are typically looking towards like pre-existing like yoga studio spaces is to just kind of shift your perspective and remind yourself that like yoga can happen anywhere. It does not have to happen at a yoga studio. The space doesn't have to be like super aesthetically pleasing. And you can also like always bring in little things to make it nicer. So for example, if the space that you find has like bright fluorescent overhead lighting and it's like not a great vibe for evening yoga classes, like bring your own, battery powered candles and little twinkle lights and little lamps that you can plug in. Like that's what I do at my classes and it works totally fine. So practical suggestions would be to look at places like wellness clinics. So places that offer physio, chiropractic care, therapy, like counseling. Even the space that I was teaching in this past weekend is like a therapy clinic during the week. And it's quiet, it's clean, like it's perfect for yoga. I would also look, and this really depends where you live, but at community halls. Sometimes these are a little bit more affordable, accessible. Sometimes they might already have things that you need, like chairs, especially if you were looking into teaching chair yoga or anything like that. I've also seen schools, depending on the district, will sometimes rent out their gym or their multi-purpose room for like community-based fitness or activities and things like that. And I mean, like, look out of the box too. Even spaces like art galleries, co-working spaces can sometimes work really, really well for yoga. And then when you are kind of choosing a space, like you may have to negotiate when it comes to the format that you're going to use for paying. So are you going to do like an hourly rental or a percentage split? And you will need to crunch the numbers and see what makes the most sense for you, especially if you are just first starting out and kind of building up your studentship and your client base. And I would just add that like even if a space, say, has a website and they're like, okay, we do rentals that are this amount per hour. I like to think that everything is negotiable and you can always make them an offer. Maybe it's not quite exactly what they're asking for, but they might be open to working with you. So I would just say for this question, when it comes to like finding reasonable spaces, is don't limit yourself to traditional yoga studios or fitness spaces. Think about where community already gathers, even if they're not necessarily doing yoga in those places. And I think that with the right group and the right schedule, like pre-reg yoga classes can happen pretty much anywhere, like within reason. So I wish you the best of luck on your search. The next question that I have in front of me here is such a big one. And I feel like this could be a full podcast episode on its own. But the question is, how do I go full-time and make yoga a business? And I feel like I could go a lot of different directions with this question, but I will share for today a couple of key things that I would keep in mind. So the first thing I want to offer is a little bit of a reframe. And I just want to say that you are already a business. So if you're teaching yoga, you already have a business. You are most likely operating as a sole proprietor, and most of us in this industry are not employees. We don't get health benefits. We're not paid vacation. We don't have the same protections in the workplace that employees have. And I would start with that, like at the forefront before you do anything, is like start to remind yourself that you already are a business. And I think that that little mindset shift will really help you see yourself as a business owner, as you move forward. The other thing that I would consider is, what does full-time mean to you? So the question was like, how do I do this full-time? Like, how do I make this a business? Because full-time is definitely not one size fits all. And this is definitely going to depend on your personal circumstances. So does full-time mean that you only teach yoga and you don't do any other type of work? Does full-time mean that you teach yoga 5 days per week and you have weekends off? Does full-time mean that you bring in a certain income from teaching yoga every month? Does it mean that you have a certain amount of time freedom that maybe you wouldn't have at like a 9-to-5 job? And so those questions are quite personal, and I would really ask yourself those types of things. Like, what does this look like for me? And then get really clear on your version of full-time before you start to work towards it. In order to make teaching full-time sustainable, there are a couple of things to keep in mind, because, there's lots of people who teach yoga full-time. And by that, I mean, like, you're teaching most days per week, you're teaching in studios and going from place to place throughout the week. And like that's totally doable and reasonable for some people. But I would definitely advise you to start to think about diversifying your offerings, because sometimes if you're like teaching full-time and you're just doing studio or fitness center drop-in classes, what happens is like you need to teach so many classes per week in order to bring in any sort of reasonable income, that you really set yourself up for burnout. And I've totally been there. So I would start to think about more offerings that are in your name and are run independently through you. So that can be things like private lessons, workshops, retreats, pre-registered classes, online courses, online workshops. Like, there's so many different things that it could be, but I would, start running more things on your own. And then that way you're building a brand and you're building a student base that really is yours. Yeah. And not that we like own our students or anything like that, but it's more like those offerings that you're putting out there are yours. And that tends to be a really great way to build up your business more sustainably. When I quit my corporate post-secondary institution job many years ago now and decided to pursue teaching yoga full-time, I fell into the trap that so many yoga teachers do, where I was teaching so many drop-in classes and teaching in so many studios and just spent every day driving all over my area from place to place. And I really was not making very much money at all. And what helped me make it more sustainable was diversifying my offerings. So that meant that I started working with more private clients, and I was, still driving around and going like to people's houses to teach, but those private sessions paid quite a bit more than drop-in classes, which meant that I was able to, drop some of those drop-in classes from my schedule. I also started running like workshops on weekends, events on weekends, and all of those things were run like independently in my own name. And that definitely made a difference. Excuse me. There were also times when I was working like full-time within the yoga industry, but not all of my income was coming from teaching yoga. So when I was like, quote unquote, a full-time yoga teacher, I sometimes would pick up shifts like doing administrative work at one of my local studios or like covering the front desk at a local studio. I worked for a couple years for like a online yoga app and did a bunch of work for them remotely, like behind the scenes. And so, I was still in the industry, but I was picking up other work from time to time to kind of supplement my income. So that is definitely something, to take into consideration. And when you decide to go full time, like if you decide, oh, I'm just going to teach yoga, I would keep in mind that there are a lot more hours outside of the classroom that go into really running a sustainable business. And those hours, like, you're not directly paid for, but they're part of the bigger picture. So you are going to be spending more time like doing marketing, doing admin, making sure that everything is like running really well and really tightly in your own business. And it's not something that happens overnight, but I would say like that first small step is first reframe things, remind yourself that you already have a business, and then start to diversify what you're already doing and create some offerings that are just from you, just in your own name. And that's a really, really great way to build up sustainably. The next question I have, I'm going to like paraphrase a little bit because it's quite long, but the core question here is essentially, how do I build a daytime student base? And this question here, like with the context of, that came with the question, because there was a little bit more there, is that this teacher is looking to run a class that's maybe like 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. And they're struggling to figure out how to get people in the door because a lot of people are working during that time. And I first just want to say that this is such a valid challenge because daytime classes do tend to have a bit of a different demographic from evening classes or weekend classes. And those like mid-morning or midday classes are probably not going to work for, people who are working 9 to 5, stay-at-home parents who are like busy, maybe with multiple children. And so you're not necessarily going to attract like that typical working professional crowd. But, just from my personal perspective, as someone who is self-employed, I love attending a mid-morning class, especially like during the week if I'm going to fitness classes, spin classes. I don't want to go to the 6 a.m. class because, first of all, I don't have to. Like, I've totally been there, but I like to leave the 6 a.m. time slot for the people who, need to work out before work. But I would prefer to get up, drink my coffee, check my emails, take a look at, what I need to do that particular day, and then go move my body like closer to mid-morning. And when I do go to those daytime classes, like there are definitely people there. So people are moving their bodies in the daytime. And I don't know, if those other people are retired or if they're also self-employed. Like, I don't know what their personal situation is that allows them to be in those classes, but there are people who are exercising in the daytime. So that's just like there to encourage you. But if you are thinking about like who is available during the day, the first group of people that my mind automatically goes to are older adults or retirees. So these people typically want to stay active. They like a consistent mid-morning routine. When I used to teach a ton of chair yoga, and just like mat yoga as well for older adults, it was always mid-morning, and those classes were super busy. I also think about, in terms of like the demographic that might like to come to a yoga practice mid-morning, I think about self-employed people like myself, entrepreneurs, freelancers, people who have just like a little bit more flexibility in their day. And then I would definitely also think about like shift workers. And it might be harder to reach shift workers consistently just because like they're usually working for a certain amount of days and then off for a certain amount of days. But that is another kind of group that you could look into. So in terms of like creative approaches to get some folks from these demographics in the door, I would definitely look at some more niche or specialized offerings. So something like, gentle yoga for healthy aging, for example, is probably going to attract like those older adults who are most likely available during that time of day. I am also curious, and like this might be an insane idea, but I'm just going to throw it out there. I'm also curious about kind of the logistics behind like a parent-friendly yoga class. And you can shut me down if this is nuts. But so like when I think about this, I think of like mom and baby yoga classes, for example. So the moms come, they bring their babies, and everybody is there with the understanding that like the babies are going to do their baby things during class. So they might cry, they might scream, they might crawl around, they might need to be fed. And like, it's fine and nobody's bothered by it because that's what everybody signed up for and everybody's there with their baby. And I wonder if there's like any way that you could kind of cater a class towards like stay-at-home moms or stay-at-home parents who most likely have small kids that like aren't school age yet. And I wonder if there would be any way to bring them in, let them bring their kids, set up like some kind of like quiet activity in the room, like coloring or a craft or something like that. And like you teach a class for the parents and the kids are there and like it might be a little bit chaotic. There might be some interruptions, but I think it also could be fun and like the parents could still get some form of yoga practice in and there's a chance to connect with other people. I don't know if that idea is like totally out there, but I feel like it could be supportive. So yeah, let me know if you think if that's like a crazy idea or not. But yeah, I think you kind of have to think a little bit outside of the box with, daytime classes. And you do have to have realistic expectations that like these classes are just not going to be as busy as like an earlier morning class or an evening class. They're probably going to take a little bit longer to build. And I would focus less on like filling the entire room and more on getting just a couple of like really consistent students who want to be there and are willing to show up every week, because I think that consistency and the word of mouth that comes from like those kinds of classes could definitely allow them to grow. So it's not that daytime yoga classes aren't going to work, but you just need to be really, really clear about who they're for and how you're framing those classes. And I think that, with time and with patience, you will be able to get people in class in the daytime. Last question that I'm going to answer for today's episode is, how do you make time for your own yoga practice when life gets busy? So, such a good question, and so real. I think like all of us as yoga teachers, have been there and have experienced those ebbs and flows that come with our personal relationship to practice. So first thing I want to say is that every aspect of life can be practice. And yeah, my philosophy these days is really about balance and what I need to do in order to feel more balanced. And the act of teaching in itself can sometimes create a little bit of an imbalance. And the example that I want to give you is like when I'm teaching 200-hour yoga teacher training, for example, that work can be surprisingly sedentary. And I feel like maybe from an outside perspective, like if you don't teach yoga, you wouldn't guess that. You would think like, oh, you must just be like doing yoga all day long. But that is really not the case. I'm usually teaching a class, delivering like long lectures with lecture slides and PowerPoints. And then I'm usually supervising like teaching practice or some type of activity or discussion. And it's a lot of sitting, it's a lot of standing, it's a lot of holding space for people's emotions and transformations. It's a lot of mental energy where like as the teacher running the training, I just have to be on and like ready to answer any question that comes at me at any time. And after spending like 20 hours in the studio on a weekend, the last thing I want to do is go back to the studio and do another yoga practice, like just to be super, super honest with you. And so for me to find like the most balance, especially when I'm teaching trainings and I'm feeling like it's kind of sedentary, is that I need to prioritize movement that's going to help me like discharge some of that energy. And so I really, really make it a priority when I'm running trainings and just when I'm not running trainings as well to schedule non-yoga related movement into my week. And I will get like to the yoga part in a second. But in terms of movement, like I don't think that yoga asana is a complete movement practice. So during my week, I'm usually trying to make sure that I get to a couple of spin classes, like for cardiovascular health. I'm usually trying to get to a couple of strength training classes. I'm also prioritizing movement that is outdoors because I find that, again, like teaching inside, because whenever I'm teaching yoga, like it's always inside, it can just start to feel a little bit stuffy and it can feel like you haven't seen the daylight all weekend. So I'm making sure that I'm going for walks with a friend or like walks with my dog and that I'm getting like a balanced movement practice throughout the week. And then these days, my yoga practice really happens in private. It really happens at home most of the time. And I'm adapting it based on my needs. It's always about coming back to a place of balance for me. So in a regular week, like I am mixing up a bunch of different movement practices because I do find that that's what works for me at this particular phase of my life. And it's not that I don't value like tapas or like a disciplined yoga practice, because I really do. And I think that that's necessary for us to create change. But I also think that we go through phases as practitioners of yoga, as yoga teachers, where like sometimes we really need to be in a classroom with a teacher and we need to have like the guidance of a yoga teacher. Other times, maybe we're practicing online. Other times we're practicing at home, like under our own guidance. And I think that that can kind of flow and evolve throughout the phases of our lives. The other thing that I look at with my yoga practice, and this is more like big picture in terms of like the calendar of the year, is I make sure to schedule myself some trainings, some workshops, maybe some special classes, whatever it is that sparks my interest at that time. Like I make sure to go seek out those things so that I'm supporting my personal growth, I'm supporting my own yoga practice, and I'm also staying inspired when it comes to my teaching. So for me, making space for my own yoga practice when life gets busy is a priority. And it usually happens like so behind the scenes, like just late at night, in the dark, in like my pajamas. It's not aesthetic. That's usually when yoga is happening, and that's usually when I need it the most too. And then, just making sure that I am incorporating other types of movement into the week, because I also find that like keeps me strong and gives me the energy to keep teaching and keep being creative. And I think that, our relationship to practice is like, it's always going to change, especially as we get older. Yeah. So those were the questions that I had time to answer today. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. If I got around to your question today, let me know if these responses helped, if they resonate with you at all. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for being here. I will see you next time.